all the points that you see in orange, these are the regions in the world that are facing water stress. And water stress means that we don't have in some periods of the year enough water to have our daily water consumption covered. And when we're looking at the numbers, this becomes even more clear. So 40% of the population is living in countries with water stress. And if you're looking at 2050 and the calculations up to then, it can increase even to 55% of people living in water stressed regions. So this is why we clearly have to find a way how to decrease water stress, because water stress is one of the main causes also for water conflicts in the world. And as I already said, rivers are our main focus of interest, and especially rivers that are crossing borders. For example, the Colorado River is one of the biggest rivers, and in the Colorado River alone, the water is serving up to 40 million residents in the United States. So it's approximately 12% that is taking the water of the Colorado River in 7 different US states. Only 10% of the Colorado River is also flowing in Mexico, but as said, this is a transboundary river because of Mexico and the United States. So why is water so important, or why is water so interesting for us, especially because we're from a management perspective, right? So we're not looking at water from a biological perspective or from a jurisdictional perspective, but more from a management perspective. Water is a common pool resource. So we don't have to explain you, I guess, what common pool resources are, but very briefly, like fisheries, river basins, forests, or grazing land, common pool resources are mainly characterized by 2 characteristics. The first one is rebellious in consumption. So meaning that when I'm consuming, and I'm free to consume because I can go to the river, I can take the water. If I'm consuming or if I'm over-consuming, I will limit the consumption possibilities of another person. And as I already said, it's non-excludable. So if I'm going there, I cannot say to David, you are not allowed to go there. So this is what we define common pool resources as. And this is why it's so important to have a thinking about the management and the governance of common pool resources. And this is where we as innovation management scholars come into place, because we're especially interested in this governance mechanisms of common pool resources in our case. Water. The tragedy of the commons. This is when we're overconsuming, or the possibility of overconsuming our commons. We need water, we have limited access, or we have limited water. But what if we're overconsuming? What if one actor is polluting our water? We are then polluting the water for everybody. So we cannot exclude the people, but we can also, we need to have mechanisms on how to manage these common pool resources. And I'm very proud to say that there was the first woman that received the Nobel Prize, and she said, okay, we have to figure out a way how to manage these common pool resources and how to really find kind of guidelines on how to manage water, how to manage forestries, fisheries. So Eleanor Ostrom, she is the author of Governing the Commons, the Evolution of Institutions for Collective Action. So she really, with her husband, was thinking about, okay, what guidelines do we have to follow in order to best manage the common goods, in order to prevent conflicts around them. And she came up with different ideas or mechanisms, 8 in some, that she said are mainly or are the basic for managing common pool resources. And I won't go into detail here, but the main idea was, of course, we have to kind of know who's involved in the common pool resource. So who's the stakeholder around a river, for example? Who determines the rules? So there has kind of be a rule around managing or like using the common pool resource, and how is compliance with the rule ensured? And in these 3 areas, she defined the 8 principles on really how to then manage common pool resources. And when we're coming back to a river, like for example, in Germany, the Rhine, then we can say, okay, we have clearly defined boundaries. We have the Rhine here in Germany flowing. We have to define who are the stakeholders around the Rhine and so on. But when we're then thinking the Rhine is not only flowing in Germany, but is of course also going into neighboring countries, then it becomes even more complex. And this complexity of rivers or river basins that are flowing into different countries, or that are, the water is used by different nations, the most prominent example is the Nile example. So the Nile has supplying, or is supplying water for 12 nations in Africa and 270 million people. So 20% of the whole African population is using the water of the Nile. And Egypt alone draws 90% of the water resources that they are using from the Nile, and 80% of these are then used for agriculture in Egypt. And Egypt is also generating electricity via a dam. You can see it on the map there. On the upper side, there's the awesome dam. And so the Nile from these 12 nations up to Egypt is serving all the people and the countries with water and, of course, also electricity. But what happened now is that Ethiopia said, okay, we're building a dam because we also want to, of course, use the water. We also want to generate electricity. And the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam has been constructed from 2011 to 2023 in different areas, or in different phases, in that they stored the water and filled the dam. But the problem with it is that Ethiopia building the dam on the Upper Nile, and then Egypt, for example, using the water and also storing the water, a lot of conflict potential arose because Egypt was saying, how can you take our water away? We are depending on the water. But then the problem is, how can we, or what mechanisms do we need to tell Ethiopia, please don't? Because we have to find a common agreement, because Ethiopia has the same kind of sayings around it, right? They are saying, okay, we also need the water. We also want to store the dam or the water with using the electricity. So I think it was up to people saying that there will be the next war around water, or that the next war in the region will be around water because of these different usages of the water. So our big question here is, how can such conflicts be avoided, and in contrast, cooperation around transnational rivers and lakes be promoted? So how can we deal with this example of the Nile from a management perspective? And here again, Eleanor Ostrom has an answer, because she said we need polycentric governance systems. So she said we need a system for regulating, for example, as in our case, rivers, from different and independent agreements, actors, organizations, and decision makers who cooperate and coordinate with each other in a seemingly uncoordinated way. So we need kind of mechanisms and governance mechanisms to be in place in order to do so. And one of these mechanisms, for example, can be river basin organizations. River basin organizations are international organizations about or around transnational rivers. As I said, most of the international institutional actors, they monitor, for example, the use of the water, they share information about the water, they are kind of a governance system around the water. And there are around a little bit more than 120 of such RBOs in the international context. And this is where our research is taking place, because we were asking ourselves, okay, how can we manage and govern water with the help of RBOs, but also what other governance mechanisms do we need in order to really prevent conflicts?
So when we listen to Christina, it seems that everything has been solved, right? There's a Nobel Prize saying, okay, there are these 8 design principles around water and water basins, and if we follow those basins, there will be hopefully cooperation and no conflicts. However, Eleanor Ostrom did her work on national rivers, right? And these principles have been developed on, for instance, managing rivers such as Colorado, because it mainly flows just in the US, and there is a coordination mechanism needed between all the riparians in the US, but still there's an overarching US law or US institutional framework around it that can help when conflicts between these different actors evolve, and which can help in the end resolve conflict also, or brings together these riparians in the end, who in a polycentric way govern this national river. But our question now was, okay, this national, the national issue seems to be solved, but the international issue might be the transnational boundary issue might be the bigger one, because I mean, there is something like the UN or so, but there's no overarching institutional framework like a country or a state that helps in mitigating conflict. So we are looking now at these RBOs as this, if you remember the definition by Ostrom, these seemingly uncoordinated way, bringing together all these polycentric governance actors or governance decision centers, so to say, bringing them together. And these RBOs serve as something like this, right? They are a commission or a committee, a non-governmental actor who brings together these different actors, not only from one country, but across boundaries. And we were asking ourselves, and now here the management scholar comes into play, right? So we have an organization now, and the question is, how can this organization and the way how this organization is organized help in bringing together these actors and thereby mitigate international conflict or even facilitate the cooperation among states and riparians, right? So basically, we are interested in understanding how different governance mechanisms like international treaties for water usage and these RBOs, how they interact in fostering cooperation and overcoming conflicts, avoiding conflicts. And then the question is, with which of these two mechanisms works better, right? Is it the organization or is it the treaty? Or do they somehow facilitate each other, or do they also restrict each other? Or does the treaty restrict the flexibility of that organization? So these were the initial questions that we had when doing that research here that we just published a couple of months ago in, I think the acceptance was just before Christmas. So that was our late Christmas or early Christmas present here. So basically, these questions here are what we are interested. And so we try to translate the ideas from Ostrom to the international context, so to say. So basically, we are looking at these two different governance mechanisms, the contractual one, the international treaty. So there are a lot of international freshwater treaties that are usually also not only bilateral between countries, but usually there are more countries ratifying such a treaty. So usually we have multiple dyads around the river where countries all signed that treaty. And they seem to establish some rules of the game. Usually in these treaties, something like rights around water, like consumption, who's allowed to do hydropower and so on, who's allowed to pollute or not allowed to pollute. There are usually some measures to handle uncertainties, right, like droughts or floods. And they usually, or quite often, not always, but from time to time, they also have some paragraphs in these treaties around what they call procedural rules. So how do we monitor the status of the river, or how do we exchange information and so on? So we came up with the hypothesis here for our research to say how that the more specified these treaties are, the lower is the likelihood that conflicts between the riparian states might arise, right? So if there is a more or less a perfect contract, right, so a very specified contract, then the likelihood of conflict is lower. But on the other hand, the likelihood of cooperation is higher between these countries. And a similar logic holds true for the organizational mechanism. So the RBO. So these are these organizations that have been established. Usually, they are working at an international level. They have different actors joining them when they more or less just establish a forum for exchange between riparians, and not only on the country level, but also industry level, and also local communities might have a saying in these forums that these RBOs establish and facilitate, right? And usually in the charter of these RBOs, they also say what this RBO is good for, right? So whether there is some mechanism to make decisions among all the actors, whether they have established something to facilitate information sharing between the riparians, whether they have some monitoring or dispute resolution mechanism, right? So all these things might be specified in the charter of these organizations. And therefore, we also came up with the idea that the better and the more of these activities that an RBO might fulfill is is given to them, or they have a mandate to do so, that the higher or the more specified that mandate is, that the likelihood of water conflict is lower, and that the likelihood of water cooperation between these countries is higher. But then the interesting question is, what if both of these mechanisms are in place, right? So how do they interact, or how do they jointly, are they jointly more or less efficient? And now here our rationale was that quite often both mechanisms are highly interconnected. So sometimes in the treaty, they also say, okay, we want to establish an RBO, right? So it's from time to time, these are really interconnected, these mechanisms. And both of them have somehow unique benefits, right? So while the treaty is somehow something that is that is quite enduring, long-term rules of the game, the organization is more flexible, right? It might react more flexibly to new situations arising. And all of us know that countries, and especially if many countries are involved, they are usually not that quick or flexible in somehow changing a treaty, right? If there are many players involved, that is nothing that is usually so easily done. But an organization might be more flexible, establishing such a forum, bring together players. They might react quicker to, let's say, a drought or something like this, right? So the idea here is that over-specifying one of them, or fully specifying one, might limit somehow the flexibility of the other, right? So in the end, we came up with the idea that they might have a substitutive effect for each other, right? So that meaning that if both are highly specified, that in such cases, or otherwise, that it's better if one is higher specified than the other. And in such ways, then conflict might be not that easily arising. But if both are very, very established or specified, in such cases, conflicts might be more likely because they somehow limit the effectiveness of each other. And on the contrary, cooperation might be even more likely when one is specified and the other is less specified, vice versa. It's both specified, then the likelihood might be lower. So that's basically the idea. And now the question was how to test these ideas. And here we take advantage of databases from friends of us at Oregon State University. They have collected data around all transboundary river basins of that world, and they are publicly available. And we basically merged many different data sets here from the so-called water event database, which is basically a database tracking events around lakes and rivers. So whether these events might be, they have a scale from -7 full-scale war to +7 ratifying a new contract or a new treaty. And then 0 is neutral. They just meet each other, right? And there are, in the end, there are 15 different levels between full-scale war and a peace treaty or something like this. And we combine that with databases on the RBOs, and then we control for various measures, as you can later see, that we draw from mainly UN or OECD databases. As I already said, our dependent variable is whether such an event happened, right? So we are looking at an event database. And in the end, we are running a competing risk model. So we are interested in whether there is a risk of entering a conflict or a cooperation over time. So we are looking at a hazard model that is stratifying for the type of and order of failure. So whether there might be also many conflicts or cooperations happening over time. So this is why we took the order of events also into account. And as I said already, the type, whether conflicts or cooperation might happen. So this is our data in the end. We are looking at an event database. So we are looking at days of risk, right? So whether there's a risk of an event happening. So we are looking at almost 4 million days at these 122 river country diets. So we don't cover all the rivers because there's not all data available for all rivers. So that's a limitation already. And we observe more than 1,000 cooperative incidents and almost 200 conflicts. And this year, yeah, you can't really see it that well, is somehow illustrating how many, so the size of the bubble, how many events, and then the share of events, whether it's a cooperation in green or a conflict in red is happening. And this is here now zoomed in for Europe. So that's basically the distribution of our data across the globe. So let's take a look at the results. So that's not that readable, right? But the most important information is here on the left-hand side. So first of all, we find that specifying the treaty more, right? So having a 1+1 standard deviation increase or higher specification of the treaty, it's leading to an 85% higher probability for cooperation, but we don't have a significant effect of the treaty specification on conflict. On the other hand, the RBO specification leads to almost the same effect size, right? So 85%, 82% in terms of cooperation. But on the other hand, the RBO specification also has an effect on conflicts, right? So that's interesting. So while the treaty is facilitating peace and cooperation, it's not avoiding conflicts. On the contrary, the RBO is able of doing both, right? And if we are looking at the effect sizes, they are more or less equally effective in facilitating peaceful action. But if we then look here at the combinations, right, we see, again, almost the same effect sizes with regards to cooperation if the treaty is more specified and the RBO is less specified, or vice versa, the treaty is less specified and the RBO is more specified. If both are highly specified, there's still a higher chance that cooperative events might happen, but this chance is much lower than if we have the +-1 combination, right? So we find also support for our substitution effect that we are hypothesizing, at least for cooperation, right? For conflict, we also do not find the significant interaction effect. So in sum, we see somehow a dominant pattern, right? So it's better if you look at these results in total, to have a higher specified RBO and a less specified treaty. Because if both are highly specified, we see that the likelihood of facilitating cooperation is only slightly increasing. But if one is more higher specified, overall, we see the main effects, similar effects, and the interaction is also similar, but the RBO is the only one that can also avoid conflicts, right? So that's somehow giving us a dominant pattern. So we should implement more specified RBOs, gives them some flexibility, also some flexibility in decision making and facilitating cooperations and avoiding conflicts. And over-specifying a treaty might limit that flexibility of these organizations, right? So now the question is to just take a small deep dive here, how the RBO in the end is doing this. And so we reran our models for these different mechanisms. So it's not about specification, a higher degree of specification. Now it's specification of the single areas of an RBO. So we had that earlier, the dispute resolution, information sharing, and so on, all these different areas. And now here we see from our results that when it comes to conflict, right? So RBOs were the only ones that could avoid conflicts. Then the question here was, so which are the mechanisms that need to be in place to avoid these conflicts? And here we see that's only information sharing. So whether there's an information sharing mandate for these organizations, and when there is a dispute resolution mechanism in place, that these are the two mechanisms that really help avoiding these international conflicts. So to sum up, basically we find some evidence that this idea of polycentric governance that Ostrom introduced also holds true if we translate that from the national to the international, to the transnational level. We find also support that in principle, both governance mechanism, contractual and organizational governance, might be helpful to facilitate cooperation, but only the RBO, this organizational governance mechanism, might also decrease the risk of conflict. That's not true for more specified contracts. So then that overall gives us a dominant pattern, as I already said, this superior governance configuration where we have treaties in place, yes, but not treaties that are very, very much specified in principle, according to the Vienna law rule book or something like this. There's something in law studies. There could be, in principle, 21 areas that the international treaty on water could cover. And if you specified all of them, then we have a really highly specified treaty, but that leaves, not really, freedom to operate and maneuver for these RBO, and therefore the dominant configuration somehow seems to be that the treaty is only covering, specific areas, but not all areas, but the RBO needs to be highly specified. So to be honest, we didn't look into that could be future research, into the areas of the treaty that should be specified and which should not be specified, right? So that deep we didn't dig in our paper here.
Exactly. But what we figured out, as David already said, is the importance of RBOs. So RBOs are highly important for international water management. And what he also said is that, for example, or especially information sharing is key. And then we're coming to the next boundary, right? Because especially when it comes to international information sharing, we have data problems, we have information sharing problems, of course. So what are we doing now? What is our next steps? So we want to further deep dive into the RBO topic and the idea of how to share information, especially data-driven technology innovations. So we're asking ourselves, okay, what data are RBOs using? How are they using data-driven innovations? And how does it help them to create value for the recipients countries and states and stakeholders, but also, of course, internally? How can RBOs increase their own organizational and, of course, then also societal value? And why are we especially interested in that? Because we came up through our whole research around water and water conflicts to the 2010 Pakistan flood. One of the most dangerous, or how do you call it? What do you say? Devastating floods, because 18 million people has been affected in Pakistan. A lot of death, nearly 2,000, and 20%, as we can also see here on the map, of the country was flooded. So, and then after the flood, of course, there were diseases and so on that really caused damage to the country, to the people, and of course also to the economy. The problem in bracket was that this flood has been, that you could see the flood coming when looking at Earth observation data. So after the dramatic flood, NASA said that you could clearly see that coming because of certain weather events, of certain circumstances. But the data wasn't used for the river basin, and of course also not for the RBO in order to do something. Of course, the flood couldn't have prevented by using the data, but you could have been way more prepared and you could have made better predictions to do so. So we're asking ourselves, how can we use these data, for example, Earth observation data, for example, data for building digital twins of rivers in order to really predict events coming? And how could RBOs use them and share this information throughout the stakeholders in order to be better prepared for such events and in order to better calculate such events? So this is what we're doing at the moment in a collaboration between Bonn, Aachen, and the University of Cambridge. Then we're also deep diving in the financing structures of the RBOs because, as said, the RBOs are international organizations. And how is the financing then, of course, also affecting the credibility, processes, and reputation of the RBOs? Because we talked to a lot of RBOs and heads of RBOs, and they were saying sometimes they have the most fancy buildings in a city or in a town. And if asking the people, what is this building standing for? Well, who's inside? Nobody knows. Because the RBOs, they they really have a reputation problem. They're just not known as being an RBO, as working for the rivers and for the water. So we're asking also ourselves about the structures behind that. And then, of course, also how do they learn and can improve effectiveness over time? And this is also covering, of course, the other topics that I already mentioned. So this is what we are doing at the moment, based on the findings that David already presented in our study. And that's it from our side. Thank you very much.